Greetings and salutations, everyone, for this week's reaction video. This week we have Sean McDowell and Dr. Titus Kennedy. I think of both of them are at Talbot University. Titus Kennedy over here to my right is a field archaeologist working for the Discovery Institute, and I think Sean McDowell really doesn't need an introduction. He's a famous apologist working at Biola University as well. And today they're going to talk about the Exodus, specifically the early date for the Exodus. Now, I'm not sure if I've really got into it, but I'm of the late date camp. If you guys know already, then you know. But today they're going to discuss some the early date and a defense. Titus Kennedy will present a defense of the early date here. As you probably already know, I actually did a little work beforehand on this, which isn't what I normally do with reaction videos. Usually my reaction videos are immediate, off the cuff, and kind of surprising, I guess, if you will. I really can't find a better description of it. But those are usually my videos. This one is slightly different. As you can see, this one is about an hour long, so we're going to divide it up into halves. We're going to have it. So, I've got some stuff prepared in the background. You can't see it. So, as we go along, I'll bring some of these images up and some of the text up. I will give you a warning. I will be speaking French a little bit. It's just a small sentence, and then I'll translate it. So, without further ado, here we go. Sean McDowell interviews Dr. Titus Kennedy. I think, Sean McDowell, if you ever watch this, I'm sorry, but I think you have a doctorate as well. So if I don't, Dr. Sean McDowell and Dr. Titus Kennedy to get it professional. So, my fault, my apologies. So here we go.
Is there actually any evidence for the Exodus? How might we respond to the claim that we frequently hear that there's no evidence for the Exodus? Well, my guest today, Dr. Titus Kennedy, is an archaeologist. He's an author of a great book called Unearthing the Bible that we're going to get into today. And he's a professor with me at Biola University. And he takes a contrarian position on the Exodus and thinks there's some very good evidence we're going to unpack today. Dr. Kennedy, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me back, Sean.
Absolutely. Well, let's just jump right in. There's so much we can talk about here. And I want to know from you first, what is the common view among modern historians and archaeologists about the Exodus and the subsequent wandering in the desert?
Well, today the vast majority of scholars in many different fields would view the Exodus as mythical. And so they're saying it basically never happened. Some of them might talk about, oh, there's a historical memory of some sort of group of people migrating, but essentially what's found in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, they're saying that didn't happen. The main reason, I think, really falls into two different categories. One is coming from an ideological or a scholarly perspective, going back to the documentary hypothesis, and that's the whole idea about what are the sources for the Hebrew Bible and when were they written and who wrote those. And essentially, it's saying that the Hebrew Bible, especially the earlier books, were written much later than they claim to be by anonymous authors, and that a lot of it was just propaganda. So they're saying it's unhistorical, and that's the schematic that they're looking at when they're looking at these early biblical stories. And so they're presupposing essentially that they shouldn't be historical even. Now, that came about partly as a result of the lack of archaeological evidence. When this theory really came about was in the 19th century, when it came to fruition, so to speak. People had ideas before. But then if we look even later, up to the mid-20th century, we're also seeing a lack of clear archaeological evidence for the Exodus that late, into the 1950s and so. And then when scholars are assessing this, they have professors who came from before them. They're looking at articles and books that were published earlier, and they're saying, where is the evidence for that? And so it was essentially decided in academia, and it's a settled question. And so very few people are really looking into, is there new evidence for the Exodus, and what may have been found within recent decades that could help us to answer that question.
Okay, I just wanted to let him finish. On the whole, as far as Egyptologists and scholars in academia saying that there is no Exodus, a majority of them, there are some scholars, Egyptologists, Egyptologists, and some biblical scholars who don't believe in the Exodus. It's absolutely true. However, on the flip side of that, there are also biblical scholars and Egyptologists who also believe that an exodus occurred, or some sort of exodus occurred in Egypt. As far as the consensus thing, whether it's a settled question, the Exodus didn't happen, no, it is not settled, in my opinion. I don't think it's settled at all that the Exodus did or didn't happen. Of course, my opinion is that the Exodus did happen, but it didn't happen the way Dr. Kennedy here uh, will go on to defend the early period. So I just wanted to let him finish and then move on. So, um,
That's really helpful to say it's a matter of philosophical approach and consensus. But as you argued, we're going to get into, it seems that the tide may be shifting, at least in terms of the available evidence that's been found. Now, as we start
I'm going to get a quick jump in here before Dr. Kennedy, answers this question. Yes, there is a shift from biblical minimalism to biblical maximalism, and this would also include the Exodus account. So,
tell us what position you take on the Exodus and why.
I take the position that the Exodus was an historical event, and I do so because for my investigation and investigations of many colleagues and other scholars who I haven't met but I've read or listened to, they have uncovered and I have looked at what seems to be evidence for components of the Exodus story. We're not going to cover or be able to connect every single passage in the Exodus story to
Sure.
archaeological evidence. But there is a framework and there are many specifics also that I think that we now have evidence for. And to me, that's really compelling. And I think it supports the view that this ancient text is telling a story of something that actually happened.
I'm looking forward to getting into some of these pieces that tell a story that supports the Exodus in your view. But first off, I think a question is helpful for people and myself is like, what kind of evidence should we expect for an event like the Exodus roughly 3,000 plus years ago?
Yeah, and that's a great question because people need to be going into this with the proper expectations. And what we should expect is very minimal archaeological evidence of an event like this because we need to look at it in broader terms. Forget about it as a Bible story. Just think about it as some event in history. Well, what is it? We have an ethnic group living in Egypt who are part of a.
keep in mind, I'll let him continue here in a minute. I just want to interject. It's an ethnic groups. They're Semitic Amorites who came into Egypt. Um, he should have. I think he should have been more specific and said ethnic groups. There are different people groups that entered Egypt. Rather than just one, it was several Semitic Amorites who entered Egypt. So, one minor complaint there.
Larger slave population who then leave the country during a period of calamities and they show up in the east, east of there in Canaan, and they settle there. And so, if we're thinking about well, what kind of archaeological evidence is going to be left behind, this partial slave population that exits the country, there really shouldn't be much. Now, we have other material in the Exodus story, locations and people and some events that we might more plausibly expect to uncover something about those geographic places, those names or officials. But in terms of the overarching story, we really shouldn't expect to find much of anything. And it really shouldn't be surprising, actually, if we found nothing. It was 3,500 years ago, roughly, over 3,000 years ago. You just don't find so many details of archaeological evidence for migrations.
So if we found nothing, it wouldn't mean that it was false, but in fact, we have positive evidence to make this case we're going to get into. Now, how much you make of the point that, in sense of, we wouldn't expect to find a lot, because if this event happened as is described in Exodus, it'd be pretty embarrassing and humiliating for the Pharaoh of that day to be decimated by a group of slaves and to lose slaves. How much how much credence do you give to that point? Because that seems to even lower the bar even further.
This is something that Egyptologists would tell you, that the ancient Egyptians, in their official or royal annals, did not record their losses or their embarrassments. And so, if that is
He's absolutely correct, too. Now, while I'm not an Egyptologist, I will admit that here, but we have religious texts on Egyptian tombs that record the successes of those who occupy those or occupied those tombs. Pharaoh included, the king of Egypt included, only recorded his successes. You only recorded your successes to the gods. You never recorded your failures to the gods. Ever. So he's absolutely right. So.
is the kind of event that we're looking for, we're not going to find it inscribed into the walls of the temple that some pharaoh had commissioned to talk about events during his reign. That's just not going to happen, and that's fairly typical of ancient cultures. They didn't record their losses and their embarrassments, at least not in the official records. But as you said earlier, and I reiterated, an absence of evidence in this type of situation does not mean that it didn't happen. Now, we can't.
I should like to note here, as Dr. Kennedy unfolds, is that that's a wonderful stopping point there. McDowell with his eyes closed, but sorry. One of the things also in Egyptian tombs is that the pharaohs, in particular, the kings, in particular, were all about self-aggrandizement. That's why you see Ramesses II saying he came back and won against the Hittites. Well, history tells a different tale, of course. So things like that you have to be careful for as well. So
demonstrate that it happened if we have an absence of evidence, but we also can't demonstrate that it didn't happen just because we haven't yet found something.
Now you have this what's called a point A to point B argument, which we're going to get into, but a couple questions first before we jump in again that I think will be helpful. Sometimes claims are made that the population figures in Exodus and Numbers of the 100,000s are not translated correctly, and the real number should be in the tens of thousands. What do you make of that idea? Is it possible? Is it probable or unlikely?
So it's, first of all, it's plausible based on the options we have for translating this particular Hebrew word. And if we look at all of the different numbers connected to the Exodus population in those various passages, then it's very plausible. There's really only one passage that is a serious problem. But when we look at things like archaeological demography, so studying ancient populations through archaeology, and we look at other ancient sources that discuss this question or the population of the Hebrews at that time, such as in Manetho or in Josephus, all of that data suggests that it was a much smaller.
And he's absolutely correct. I actually agree with him. The word in question is aleph, which can mean a unit as well as thousand. So instead of having these grandiose numbers that some of our translations today have, the numbers were actually rather smaller. Avaris itself, which is where the city, which is the city where the Semitic Amorites resided, had a population of, I think, 35 to 50,000. And that was, I'm not sure if that was in the 18th dynasty, so roughly the 15th century. On even before, when it was founded in the Middle Kingdom. Avaris was founded in the Middle Kingdom. And it existed, and it was inhabited all the way down to the Exodus, to the 13th century. So, and the city itself had roughly 35 to 50,000 inhabitants. So to get these grandiose numbers in the Bible seems a bit, I don't even know how to describe it, but I don't want to use ludicrous because I think that's too strong of a word, but it just seems too large. So reduce the numbers a bit, and it looks a bit more realistic of the kind of people who left Avaris. And
population, like around 100,000 or less people. And logistically, that makes a lot more sense too. So I think that that suggestion is plausible. I think that it's even likely, and I think there are some strong arguments that can be made to demonstrate that from a variety of different types of evidence.
So if that were the case, then the common translations in the English Bible that has hundreds of thousands might be mistaken and lead to different expectations in terms of the archaeological evidence we would find. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And that is a component of the story that has been criticized archaeologically just on the basis, again, of logistics, of things like how could that many people have moved from here to there, all the sacrifices, also, the population of Egypt overall at the time, these things just not lining up.
one thing I will note here is the migration that happened across the Sinai Peninsula. Now, with their cattle, with their herds, and these people, the interesting fact here, and I think this has been brought up before if you watch David Falk's channel on Ancient Egypt in the Bible, is he brought this up in one of his videos as well. The Sinai was a savanna during the second millennium BC, late Bronze Age, LBA if you will, or early Iron Age. It was a savanna, so it was grasslands everywhere for herds to graze and everything. So that's how they were able to transport their herds across the Sinai Peninsula, is you had this savanna. So, and then they had the sacrificial animals. So that's how they were able to get across the savanna all those years. So, just an interesting point I thought I'd bring up.
It caused a real problem for many scholars, and then resulted in them just throwing out the Exodus story because they look at specific sections like this and they say, that doesn't make any sense. So,
Okay.
the whole story must not have a lot of credence.
Well, there's also a big debate about the dating of the Exodus itself. Can you tell us which position you take on the
Here's where we're probably going to differ, because now he's going to get into specifics about the early date versus the late date.
dating of the Exodus and why?
I would date the Exodus to the 15th century BC, and in Egyptian terms, this would be during the 18th dynasty. Now, I do so for two major reasons. The first is the chronological information that we get in the Hebrew Bible. I take those specific numbers that are given as real numbers rather than figurative or idealized types of numbers. So
And that's where we would disagree. I would imagine here he's going to go into 1 Kings 6 and then interpret the 480 years that are listed in 1 Kings 6 as literal years. It becomes a problem later on, and we'll talk about that as we come to it. Especially with the Mesopotamian sexagesmal count. So, if you will, I can't think of a better term for that, but we'll get there.
we have passages like 1 Kings 6:1 that tells us in the fourth year of Solomon's reign, in the month of Ziv, and then it says it was the 480th year after the Israelites came up out of Egypt. So it gets into some really detailed numbers.
But what he doesn't factor in here, Kennedy doesn't factor in here is the again the sexagesmal thing in Mesopotamia. Everything's based on sixes or 60s, just like in Israel or in some certain Semitic populations out of which the Hebrews sprung. You had things based on the number 40. You had 40. Everything's divisible by 40. So 12. Or 400 sometimes, if you will. So 4s, 12s, 40, 400, 480, things like that. There's a reason why. It's just to really say a long period of time. That's why you get 40 years in Judges over and over and over. You had 40 years of peace. Well, it doesn't mean a literal 40 years. It just means a long period of time of peace before they fell away again and they needed a judge to bring them back to Yahweh, to God. So I think that's a fundamental mistake that he makes here, taking this passage, 1 Kings 6:1, literally, woodenly, and literally. You cannot simply do that with every single number. I think we mentioned that on my video with the answers in Genesis on dating Noah's flood, or the creation account. The 3 video series I did with answers in Genesis is you cannot take some of these numbers literally. Not every number in the Old Testament and New is meant to be taken literally. You can't do that over and over and over and over consistently like that, because you'll come up with some wacky interpretations.
I would then say, all right, well, let's look 479 years earlier. Other people take different views on that. They look at it as 12 idealized generations of 40 years. And we have other passages, though, like Judges 11:26, that says the Israelites have been in the land for about 300 years.
And about that passage was it's actually a direct quote. It's actually a direct quote, Judges 11:26, and he gets it wrong. The quote itself is wrong. At least the number in the quote is wrong. So,
years in the time of Jephthah, which would be about 1100 BC. Okay, well, we could also, with a different hermeneutic, say again, oh, that's just an idealized number, a figurative number. And even in First Chronicles, where it talks about 19 generations between Moses and Solomon, which fits really well with the 15th century BC idea, they might also say, again, this is it's just some kind of figurative genealogy that's not meant to be taken exact like that. So I don't think that we can solve it hermeneutically. We're going to always be running around each other in circles. But what we can do then is evaluate the archaeological evidence for these different chronological frameworks and see which is the one that seems to yield the archaeological evidence for the Exodus, or the best, most clear evidence. And I would say the 18th dynasty does, and that's what we can look at today.
Well, some of the facts we're going to get into are just fascinating. The first time I learned some of this, but I want to make sure our audience sees that your dating is based on biblical passages like 1 Kings 6, when the temple is born.
For the record, our late date is also based on biblical passages. Nothing against McDowell here, but I feel that saying that could cause some problems. And the late date certainly does rely on biblical passages for their evidence. It relies on textual evidence found within the Exodus account to support or elevate or the 13th century date. So I'm just throwing that out there. It's just I don't like that he said it that way. So, but maybe it's just me. Who knows? So I'll let them digress here.
Born, temple was made, etc., dating back to the Exodus itself. And extra biblically, some of the facts we're going to look at, you think line up nicely and tell us there's good reason to believe the biblical story of the Exodus, taken straightforward, happened. Now, walk us through, and then after this one, we're going to jump right into particular evidence, but explain your approach to this, because when people are looking at the evidence for the Exodus, they approach it with a different methodology. Your methodology is very helpful, and you kind of call it a point A to a point B argument. Explain.
So if we take it down to the most basic level, the Exodus story is a movement of some people from point A to point B. We have Hebrews living in Egypt prior to time 1.
Semitic Amorites living in Egypt.
And then we have Hebrews settled in Canaan after time 1.
Again, Semitic Amorites
and so they were here, and then they moved here. And we have a chronological framework for that. So if we have evidence of Hebrews living in Egypt prior to the Exodus, and then evidence of Hebrews popping up in Canaan after the Exodus, that is the general story that we've got. And hopefully we would at least be able to demonstrate those two things. Otherwise, we really can't say that we have archaeological or historical evidence for the Exodus. We just say we have an ancient text that tells us.
So we're not looking for a particular text that just gives us everything. We're piecing together the time frame and the events, and we find these kind of puzzle pieces that fit the narrative and support the biblical account as a whole, is kind of this methodology, which makes a lot of sense. So let's start with point A, so to speak. Do we have reason to believe that the Hebrews were actually living in Egypt the time that the book of Exodus would describe that they were there?
We do, and we could look at a few different components of this argument. I would start more broadly with, is there evidence that Semites were living in what the Bible calls the land of Goshen prior
Okay.
to the Exodus? That is the northeast Nile Delta region. We even have the name Goshen or something very similar to it found in a 19th dynasty Egyptian text that
Which baffles me. He just mentions the 19th dynasty here like it's nothing. We have a text that had mentions Goshen and it's dated to the 19th dynasty. But anyway, I just find that part of the interview funny, if you will. So
that puts it in that region. So we know it's the right area and it was an ancient name. And as far
certainly is. I'm so sorry. My sarcasm's dripping here. Yeah, it is in the right area because it was in the 13th century. It was during the 19th dynasty. But sorry.
as Semites living there, yes, definitely. We have a huge amount of evidence. It's several different archaeological sites like Tel El Daba, which is a very important site. We've got Tel Rataba, we've got Tel Maskuda, we've Tel Yehudia. So these are all sites where we have Semites living during what is called the Second Intermediate Period and the 18th Dynasty in some of those sites also. Now,
I will say also extending into the 19th dynasty. In and through the 19th dynasty. The Avaris port, when Avaris was abandoned, the port wasn't. Interestingly, the port lasted. So, yeah.
Now, that is the pre Exodus period. And
Okay.
that evidence consists of things like specific types of pottery and weapons, burials that were typical of people from Canaan, not from Egypt, gods, deities, and things like
Yeah.
that were.
I will add here that in Avaris, not only was Seth worshipped, but Baal was also worshipped. Because they were Baal, you guys, hopefully you guys know that Baal was a storm god, a storm deity. Just like Seth, or Set, however you decide to pronounce it, whichever transliteration you use, was also a storm god. So they were worshipped side by side. They weren't literally worshipped side by side, but we found two temples, one for Baal and one for Set. They're Seth. So, yeah.
Were imported. We even have inscriptions with Semitic names found in these places at that time. So that idea is fine. Egyptian artwork shows immigration and text shows immigration into Egypt from Canaan.
I will add here, I'm sorry again, I keep interjecting because I just get random thoughts. But another thing I'd like to point out is that Avaris, Lower Egypt, isn't really a good place to find archaeological facts or archaeological evidence for the Exodus or anything. Not just the Exodus, but other stuff in Egypt. It's just not a very good place. And from what I understood, again, from my friend Dr. Falk, is it's a real hassle to do archaeological work in Lower Egypt because there's a lot of red tape to go through. So, yeah.
So that would
Okay.
be our broadest type of evidence.
Okay, so point A, pre-Exodus time, we find Semitic people, and tell us why you made the distinction between Semites and the Hebrews.
So Semites is a broader group designation, roughly.
Okay, I didn't know he was going to go into an explanation, but yes, Hebrews, if you can count them that, because they're descendants of Abraham, the claim is that they're descendants of Abraham, and there were only 70 of them. Again, in Egypt, And then, of course, they multiplied according to the beginning of Exodus, and everything. And the reason why they became slaves is because they became too numerous, and they were worried they were gonna rebel and everything. So, yeah. So, but I'm happy he goes into this now. I didn't think he would. Actually, I think I forgot he did. But yeah, it's a smaller subgroup within Semitics, within the Semites.
We might call that people who spoke an ancient Semitic language. So this would include everybody from Canaan, essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
within Canaan at that time, you would have had different tribal groups and different clans and
Mm-hmm.
families. Well, the Hebrews came from one family, right? So they
Mm-hmm.
eventually became their own tribal group, but they're still Semites.
Clan.
So we just needed to see, is there evidence for that type of people living
Okay.
in Egypt before? But we can get more specific than that, and we can look at, is there evidence of Hebrews
Sorry about that,
living
guys.
in
That might be my
Egypt,
dog.
not just general Semites?
Well, let's do that. And I think the Papyrus Brooklyn helps us answer this question. And in particular, not only Semites, but Hebrew people, at least.
So this is one of the pieces I got. I've got for you guys. I'm gonna let them talk it out first, and then we'll go into it, and then I'll sort of bring it up. This is an actual picture of it here. They brought up, actually, it's probably a better picture than the one I brought. Actually, I don't even think I brought a picture. I brought a paper up on it. And unfortunately, I have to translate it because it's written in French. I'll get to translate like a sentence or two. It's not going to be too bad. So, or at least I'll highlight certain words and then translate it. So, but here we go. They're going to talk about the Papyrus Brooklyn, which dates to the Middle Kingdom, if you will, roughly the 19th century. I think it's the 19th century Middle Kingdom text, like 12th dynasty, nothing earlier than that. So
Those with Hebrew names as slaves. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. This is an incredible
Asiatic names and some Egyptian names as slaves. Yes.
important artifact, in my opinion at least, for establishing that Hebrews lived in Egypt prior to the Exodus. And that's because we have on Papyrus Brooklyn this list of servants in Egypt from about the 17th century BC. And many of the names of these servants were Semitic names. And by the way,
Mm-hmm.
these people had their original name changed into an Egyptian name, just like happened to
Mm-hmm.
Joseph. But even in more detail, some of these Semitic names are actually names that we find for Hebrews in the Bible. So most of them are feminine names. So we're going to be looking at some of these are feminine versions of male names we're familiar with, but feminine versions of names like Asher and Issachar and Jacob. We also have the name Shifra, which appears in Exodus chapter 1. That's the name of one of the Hebrew
Mm-hmm.
midwives. We've got a compound name with David. We've got a compound name with Eve or Haya. And then we even have someone's name that was apparently Hebrew. That's how it's transliterated, at least in the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So this seems to me really strong
I think he means to say a Proto-Semitic name that became Hebrew.
evidence for Hebrews living in Egypt prior to the time of the Exodus, because you really can't get more specific than names that are used by a particular ethnic group. We can't say that like this pottery form was only used by the Hebrews prior to the Exodus. That just doesn't work with material culture. So if unless we had a text that was saying the sons of Jacob were here
Right,
in
right.
Egypt, the next best thing is biblical Hebrew names of people who are servants
You're not gonna find that at all, so that's why we're laughing.
there prior to the Exodus.
So, when was this written? And this presumably lines up with the chronology that you're laying out, right?
Yeah, this dates to about the 17th century BC. So it's in this time called the Second Intermediate Period. It's a little murky chronologically.
Yeah, he's right. It's a little murky. I would actually say the 19th century, but no later than the 19th century. Um, no later than the 19th century. some scholars say it's the 12th dynasty, which I think is around that same time period. And it's definitely, some scholars will even argue that, oh wait, now I'm getting it confused. Never mind, we'll get there. I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah, I'd say it's roughly, as far as the Brooklyn Papyrus, it's dated roughly the Middle Kingdom to the first intermediate, or I mean second intermediate period.
But yeah, we can put it within
I'm sorry, first intermediate period.
that century, basically. So we're talking about 200 plus years before the Exodus, something like that.
Okay, so point A, in the pre-Exodus era, we have evidence for Semites, non-Egyptians from Canaan in the area.
And I would agree with that. There were Semites, Amoritic Semites, or Semitic Amorites, however you decide to say it, living in Egypt from the second intermediate period, late Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period, down through the New Kingdom, to the end of the 18th, to the end of Ramesses II's reign. You have Amoritic Semites living there. If you guys know your Egyptian history, you know the Hyksos were the ruling people. It's just the Egyptian word, I think, for foreigners. But they were living in, Avaris was the capital. That was the capital for the Hyksos. And they ruled from there. So, and they had been accumulating people over and over throughout the second intermediate period, that the city became so large, as I said earlier, to roughly a population of 35 to 50,000 people. So, and with the fall of the Middle Kingdom, it was the Hyksos who sort of started ruling Lower Egypt at the time, with Upper Egypt being controlled by the Egyptians, and then they were sandwiched between the Hyksos, the Amoritic Semites, and the Nubians further south. So, and that sets you up for the entrance of the New Kingdom, with pharaohs like Seken Enre and Ahmoza and Kamoza coming in and establishing rebelling against the Hyksos and reconquering. I wouldn't even say rebelling. I would say, from their point of view, they reconquered or conquered Lower Egypt, and then it's thereby establishing the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom. So that's what's going on politically and historically at the time. But yeah.
And then as we get to the period of the Exodus, dating at least around that time, we have evidence of Hebrew names and being kept as slaves. Is that our two components so far? Is that fair?
Yeah, we can look at.
I just want to show you guys. Let me see if I can find it here. Where is it? I think this is, no, that's not it. That comes later. That'll come later. Yes, here we are. So this is a paper, obviously in French, and I had highlighted, but apparently it's gone now. The highlighting stinks here, sorry. But this is a list. You have 4 columns here, A, B, C, and D. This is a grand list of the front of the Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446. And it lists here 85 workers in 4 columns. A, the first column, A, right here, A, has the title and name. B has their surname. C, their profession. And D, it mentions if they're male or female. Sometimes a child. You can see this one right here, if you guys can see it. I don't know if you can. I'm hovering underneath a female and then a male. Or is that a child? That's a child. Sorry, child, female. So, things like that. And then you get the profession there. So, moving on here in the French, it says that the list does not contain a date, which is where the debate comes in as far as the Papyrus Brooklyn is concerned. There's no date attached to this. Oops, lost my cursor. There we go. Scrolling down here, you've got, I had it, so I got to re-find it, which kind of stinks. Yeah, it's got to support what Kennedy said. It's got Asiatic names, Egyptians, and Asiatics receiving Egyptian names. Again, in line with what Dr. Kennedy says. Moving on down, I want to say it gives us an exact number of yeah, here we are. 48 Asian names or Semitic names or Asiatic names, and 29 Egyptian names. Some of the Egyptians were also a part of, on this list as slaves as well, or not really slaves, but they were given Egyptian names more likely. So, which he says right here. So, I just wanted to get you guys some evidence of it, although he's got a better picture of Papyrus Brooklyn. So, moving on here. Oh, sorry, I thought I hit play. I did not.
Look at
Here we go.
the slavery evidence that even goes beyond this list of servants, because we have a variety of Egyptian texts and different Egyptian artwork that also demonstrates that Semites, or what they often called Asiatics, were being used for slave labor, specifically in the 18th dynasty. That the beginning of that
Okay.
dynasty is really when that exploded,
Asiatics.
and that is something that also I think fits perfectly with the Exodus story.
So, is there evidence, archaeological evidence, that slaves were forced to work, such as constructing buildings, making bricks, as the Exodus story reports? And what would that evidence be?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably one of the best known and really a great visual comes from the tomb of this official Rekmirah. And
Rekmire.
on part of the walls there, there's a scene in which it shows foreign slaves, some of whom are Semitic, making mud bricks and then carrying these bricks over and then
I'll show you. This is the picture you guys saw briefly. I'll show you again the picture here he's referring to. Whoops, sorry. I was actually looking at the library there. So here's the tomb, the wall, and you can see taskmasters with their whips. There's one here, or whips or whatever. Taskmaster, taskmaster, taskmaster with a tablet. You see him, he's got a tablet. So they did keep a quota of bricks. And you see them dropping some sod. There's some bricks here. You see some mud. So you see a brick here. You see him sitting on a brick. Bricks, bricks, bricks. So you see that in this tomb. Wall of Rekmire, which is TT Theban Tomb 100, or TT 100 we call it. So yeah, I just wanted to give you guys a visual of what he's talking about here. Always helps me. So we'll let him continue.
constructing buildings. But we also know that this happened from other Egyptian texts. There's one of the Hermitage papyri that also talks about immigrant people, Semites, being forced into public building projects. So we definitely know that was going on, just like the Exodus talks about.
And is this found in, I'm afraid I might mispronounce it, but the Louvre or Louvre leather roll, does that support this case as well?
Admire him for trying. Admire him for trying. It's Louvre. I think they're talking about the museum in Paris.
It does. That one specifically looks at mud brick making and quotas. So that comes from the 19th dynasty.
Okay. Again, I just find it funny. It comes from the 19th dynasty. That's interesting. How that 19th dynasty just keeps re-emerging. Keeps re-emerging. It's very interesting.
Just after this, where I would place the Exodus period, although some would put it in that time. And this talks about how a group of slaves no longer had straw to use in the making of their mud bricks, which is really essential component to help keep it together. And as a result, they didn't meet their quota. So the quota is stated, then it says how many bricks they brought. They failed to do that, and because of it, they were beaten. Now, if we go to the book of Exodus, we see the same things happen. The Israelites were part of this slave labor force that was supposed to make mud bricks. And then they weren't given any more straw, and they couldn't make their quota. And as a result, they got punished. They got beatings for it. So exactly the same historical context is happening there.
Okay, I don't want people to miss that we've got good evidence, archaeological evidence outside the Bible for Semitic people in the area of Egypt before the Exodus. We have Hebrew names of people that date to the time of the Exodus. Evidence that they were make bricks with quotas and buildings, just as we see in the Exodus story. Now, you have this other component you've talked about that fascinated me. I'd never heard this before. It was called the weighing of the heart. What is that, and how does it allude to the Exodus story, presumably in terms of Pharaoh's heart being hardened?
So the weighing of the heart was a process in Egyptian theology
Oh,
that
sorry guys, that was my dog.
one had to go through in order to make it to paradise in the afterlife. And this process is shown on a lot of ancient Egyptian artwork, including going back to the time of the Exodus. And the basic scene would be that there are these scales, and on one side of the scale, you have the feather of truth, and then it's weighed against the deceased's heart. And if the heart is too heavy, then they don't go to paradise. Now, in the Egyptian viewpoint, the more you would sin, the heavier your heart would become. So, if we go and look at Moses's discussions with Pharaoh, we see this talk about hardening of the heart, right? Well, if you look at it in Hebrew, there's actually two different words that are used. So, it talks about how Pharaoh made his own heart heavy, which by implication is that he is sinning and sinning by opposing Yahweh. And then the other component of that is that it says that God strengthened Pharaoh's heart, basically, so that he could make it through the plagues. So Egyptians or people from that time period, Israelites, presumably.
That second one, the first word he's talking about escapes me, but the second word he's talking about is the word chazak. And chazak means to strengthen or to make strong. So that's the Hebrew word that he's talking about here, strengthening Pharaoh's heart. A lot of time in this section of Exodus, it talks about God doing it or Pharaoh himself doing it. So I just find that fascinating too, but that's a different topic.
They would understand exactly what was being said theologically, that Pharaoh is sinning, making his heart heavier, and he is not going to make it to paradise because of that.
Okay, so to this point, we have the Hebrew people in Egypt during the time of the Exodus as slaves, making bricks, etc. But then you talk about what you call the possibility of an Egyptian remembrance or record of the plagues, what's called the admonitions of an Egyptian sage, but more commonly, as far as I understand it, the Ipuwer Papyrus.
Let's see how much time's left.
What is this?
Okay, we're going to stop there, I think, at 25 minutes, 26 minutes in, and we'll finish the other 28 minutes is what it looks like. We got 28 minutes left. We'll finish the other 28 minutes for next week. They go on and talk about the Ipuwer Papyrus, but we'll talk about that later. I had that stuff, but I wasn't sure how long it would go. Again, sorry about the dog. So they go into the Ipuwer Papyrus here, and I forget what other stuff they go into, but we'll get there next week. We'll hit it. So if you like this sort of stuff, that's great. Please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel, because that would help tremendously, and it would help me continue to continue doing what again. So to keep doing it over and over again, if you will. Sorry. Until next time, I will see you guys later, and have a great weekend.